The MLB trade deadline is later this month. So let's start jumping into it. What could the Orioles and what should the Orioles do by the deadline? Well, I think number one is they need to add at least one reliever. So let's take a look at my wish list for rental relievers at the deadline. Coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And today is Wednesday, July 3rd, 2024, and welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb, and coming up on today's episode, we're going to do kind of our first installment of many trade deadline preview episodes here in the month of July. And we're going to focus on the bullpen because although you could argue starting pitching is a bigger need for the Orioles than relievers at the deadline, they're certainly going to trade for at least one relief pitcher. They're certainly going to add to this bullpen, and the bullpen can be the cheapest way to make your team better. So we're going to start with kind of the cheapest place to go, rental relievers, relief pitchers who are free agents after this year, who the Orioles could go and get to make this team better by the July 30th deadline. I'll give you my wish list of my top 6 rental relievers out there, and then little Orioles news and notes as they signed a couple of players to minor league deals last week. But that's all coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast, which is brought to you by Prize Picks, the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Just go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnMLB and use code all lowercase LockedOnMLB for a first deposit match up to $100. So as you can probably hear, I am not going to be talking about the Orioles baseball game in Seattle last night against the Mariners. I'm actually recording this here during the day on Tuesday. I've mentioned it on previous episodes because of my 9-to-5 work schedule and the fact that these games are starting at 10 p.m. on the West Coast during the week. I can just not stay up and give you an episode about the game that happened and still be able to function as a human being. So thank you for being a little patient with that. So today's episode will not address Tuesday night's game 1 in Seattle because it hasn't happened yet as I'm recording. Hopefully it was an Orioles win and they took game 1 of the series. But either way, I'll be back with Thursday's episode to recap games 1 and 2 of the series in Seattle. So instead, get kind of our first look at the trade deadline. Talked about it a little bit on Tuesday's mailbag episode. Make sure to go back and check that one out. But now we're going to get a little more specific. And I wanted to start by just looking at players who could be available and players I would like the Orioles to target at the deadline. And today we're going to start with rental relievers. When I say a rental, that means a player who is going to be a free agent after the 2024 season. Basically means, if the Orioles trade for him at some point in July, they're basically getting a half season of that player, similar to what they got out of Shintaro Fujinami and Jack Flaherty at last year's deadline before they become a free agent. So I put together a wish list. Now, I've got 6 rental relievers here that I want the Orioles to acquire. And I will tell you this, some of these guys are on teams that may not end up selling. And quite frankly, some of these 6 players may not even be dealt by this year's deadline. A lot of that is because there is just this mushy center in the National League, a whole bunch of bad baseball teams who are still 3 games or less out of the NL wildcard. And they're that close to the wild card in July, you're probably not thinking about selling off all your pieces. Now, some teams might buy and sell, where they maybe trade some of their rentals, hold on to the other guys, try and make the major league team better and still compete for a playoff spot. But there's a lot of guys in the murky middle. And then there are some other teams, admittedly, I'm going to talk about them a lot, kind of teams like the Rangers and the Blue Jays in the AL, where recent history should say, okay, they're good enough to be a playoff team, but they are so far back right now that it could make sense to at least trade off some of their rental pitchers. We will talk about some of their pitchers on this episode. But I've identified 6 rental relievers. I'm going to start with number 6 and go to number 1 on my wish list. Number 1 being, of course, the rental reliever I would like for the Orioles to trade for the most. So let's start with number 6 on my list. It is White Sox right-handed pitcher John Brebbia. Now, you may not know a lot about John Brebbia, and that's fair. He's been with the San Francisco Giants kind of as a middle reliever for most of his career, became a free agent last offseason and signed a 1-year contract with the White Sox, which of course does make him a free agent after this year. And he's been mostly, a little bit of high leverage, but mostly a middle reliever for the White Sox. But he's been really good. This year, Brebbia has his highest strikeout rate of his career. So he is striking out 29.4% of his batters and also his lowest walk rate since 2021, walking less than 6% of batters. That is a really, really good combination for John Brebbia this year. The right-hander has a pretty good ERA. Here are his stats on the season for John Brebbia, the veteran right-hander. 32 and a third innings. These are stats through play on Monday. 32 and a third innings. He does have a 5.01 ERA. And you might say, Connor, why do you want the Orioles to trade for a reliever with a 5.01 ERA? Well, if you look a bit deeper into his stats, he is much, much better than a 5.01 ERA. His expected ERA via StatCast is 4.06. His FIP, fielding independent pitching, which is a similar ERA stat that can be a little more predictive and only takes into account things that the pitcher is responsible for, which is strikeouts, walks, and home runs. A lot of times, guys, FIPs are lower when they play in front of a bad defense. He's basically playing in front of the worst defense in baseball that is not getting him extra outs. His FIP is only 3.22. And his xFIP, which is the expected fielding independent pitching, which goes even deeper on what you should be doing, is a 3.17. So what some of those numbers say is if John Brebbia was on a good baseball team with a good defense and was getting a little bit, at least more even luck, he's more of a 3 ERA pitcher than a 5 ERA pitcher. You combine that with the fact that the strikeouts are up and the walks are down for John Brebbia, this is a guy who I would like the Orioles to add. And the great thing about John Brebbia is he is going to be super cheap. You know the White Sox are going to deal him. He is a rental reliever on a horrendous Chicago team. And also, he hasn't really been, he might have gotten a couple of save opportunities for the White Sox this year, but he hasn't really been anything close to like a closer for this team, and nobody is looking to add him as a ninth inning piece. He's more of a guy who comes in and kind of secures the middle to late part of your bullpen without having to give up too much. And to me, that is a perfect combination for the Orioles. So Brebbia is number 6 because he doesn't have the upside of some of these other guys, but he's on the list because he would be maybe the cheapest option here. The Orioles would have to give up like one maybe prospect that has had a good season, but isn't really even a top 30 guy you maybe haven't even heard about, and can go get a guy who could pitch postseason innings for them and make the bullpen better. That seems, at least to me, to be a really good potential trade-off for this Oriole bullpen. Number 5 on my wish list is a veteran you might know a little bit better, and it's been around for a long time. That is the 8-year-old right-hander now, Adam Ottavino. And Ottavino is quietly having a really good year with the New York Mets. Now, the first part of this conversation is, would the Mets actually sell? Grimace has turned their season around. They are right back in the heat of the wild card race in the National League. There's a question of, would the Mets trade off anyone? There's also a chance that the Mets could kind of try to play the middle here with David Stearns as their new GM, where, you know, some of the rental pieces who aren't like gigantic parts of their team, they could sell off, like an Adam Ottavino, and then they could keep everyone else and still try and go for a playoff spot. And if they do that, or if they just kind of tank and sell off altogether, I think Adam Ottavino would be a really nice addition to the Orioles bullpen. He has pitched 32 2/3 innings for the Mets this year. And again, it's a higher ERA at 4.68, but that FIP I mentioned, which takes into account just things that a pitcher is in control of, is 3.19. His expected ERA from StatCast is 2.87. He has been getting super unlucky with basically zero help from the Mets defense this year. Another guy who could potentially be undervalued on the trade market because of how high his ERA is and how cheap he probably should be. Very, very similar to what we look at with John Brebbia. Now, Ottavino's got a pretty wide arsenal. He throws a 4-seamer, a sinker. He's known for his sweeping slider. It's had some of the most movement of any sweeper for years now. It makes him really, really good against right-handers. He's had his troubles throughout his career against lefties, but he gets strikeouts. And that is something the Orioles bullpen is kind of lacking. 31% strikeout rate for Adam Ottavino this year is his highest K rate since 2018 with the Rockies. He's getting more whiffs on his sweeper, more on his cutter. His stuff just looks a little better this year, despite the advanced age for Ottavino, and he's getting a lot of soft contact, which is a really, really good sign. He's not getting squared up. Guys are not barreling the ball against Ottavino. Only has a 31% hard hit rate against him this season. That tells me that it's all come together to be, he should be much, much better than that almost 5 ERA tells us. And I think with Baltimore, he could be a really, really nice addition to the middle relief and would not cost much at all. Number 4 on my reliever wish list is Carlos Estevez, another kind of right-handed pitcher in his 30s, but is the first guy on this list who is a closer for his current team. Estevez currently handling the 9th inning duties for the Los Angeles Angels, and once again is a rental, will be a free agent after the season. Now, the surprising part about Carlos Estevez is that on my list, these are my list of 6 players, he has the lowest walk rate. And not just on this list, but I put up on Twitter earlier this week a list of 47 relievers who I think could potentially be available at the deadline that the Orioles could target. And of all 47 of those relievers, Estevez has the lowest walk rate out of any of them. So if you're worried about walks, Estevez is not the guy to worry about. He is at the very least throwing strikes this year for the Orioles, for the Angels, and hopefully for the Orioles. And that is definitely a good sign when you are looking to trade for him. Estevez does have 16 saves, which allows him to be a guy who could fill in for Craig Kimbrell in the 9th inning from time to time. Basically gives you 2 veteran closers that you could switch out, give Kimbrell more of a rest, or if he starts to struggle, you could take him out of that role. He's got a 3.00 ERA and a 2.41 expected ERA. So even though the ERA has been good, it should be even a little bit better. Again, it's playing on a bad team. And as I mentioned, he is not walking anyone, essentially a 3% walk rate. And it still comes with, not an elite, but a very solid 27% strikeout rate to go with it. Opponents hitting just 196 against Estevez this season. It's a good fastball. He has a devastating kind of split change at times. He can get a little erratic in the past years, but not really this year, which has made him even better. Now, he does have a 239 BABIP, which is batting average on balls in play. Generally, anything below like 280, 270 means you've got a little batted ball luck on your side. And that has certainly happened at times for Estevez. And he also has an extremely low ground ball rate. He is very much a fly ball pitcher. And he's had a little bit of home run luck this year, which means despite being an extreme fly ball pitcher, probably hasn't given him up enough home runs as he maybe should. But you put him in Camden Yards, and left field plays a whole lot better for him with the deep wall. I think this is a guy where he's really improved his slider this year to go along with the fastball changeup combination. This could be another sneaky ad who I don't think would cost too much. Would definitely cost more than Brebbia and Ovino because he is a true closer, but I think would really help the back end of the Orioles bullpen. But that's number 6 through 4. Next up, going to get to the top 3 on my rental reliever wish list. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by Booking.com. Booking.yeah. Now, if you want to do some travel this MLB season, summer's heating up, you want to explore U.S. cities that you've always secretly wanted to learn more about. And yes, we're even talking about the rival cities. With hotels, bed and breakfast, vacation rentals, resorts, and so much more on Booking.com, you might just find your perfect stay even in your rival city. Listen, there is potentially a fun trip coming up to Citi Field in August to see the O's play. Now, that's not a city we love going to because that's Yankee territory. But when you go to a Mets game, it could be much more pleasant. And maybe you're saying, you know what, I'm going to Citi Field and not Yankee Stadium so I can enjoy New York a little bit more. From hotels that look over stadiums to family-friendly resorts, Booking.com has so many choices across the U.S. for your summer travel this MLB season. The right stay can make you a fan of any U.S. city, even your rivals. Book today on Booking.com on the site or in the Booking.com app. And today's episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is also brought to you by Game Time, because you need tickets to these Major League Baseball games. And Game Time is an authorized ticket marketplace of Major League Baseball, which makes getting tickets faster and easier. Prices on the Game Time app actually go down the closer it gets to first pitch. With killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee, Game Time, well, they take the guesswork, really, out of buying MLB tickets. And isn't that great? You don't have to worry about, is this going to be a real ticket? You don't have to worry about, is this really the price? No. You just go on Game Time. You can do it as close to the actual first pitch as you want. They've got last-minute deals that can save you up to 60% off buying MLB tickets. There's flash deals and exclusive zones, and you're getting the ticket. The Game Time ticket coverage or purchase is covered with the most flexible customer service policy in the industry. So take the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONMLB. That is LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. So we continue on with my Orioles rental reliever wish list as we get closer and closer to the July 30th deadline. Number 6 on my list, John Brebbia. Number 5, Adam Ottavino. Number 4, Carlos Estevez. Let's get to number 3 on the list. And number 3 is a guy who I would argue actually might be the least likely of the 6 guys on my list to actually be traded by the deadline, but would certainly help the Orioles. And that is Arizona Diamondbacks right-handed pitcher Paul Sewald, who is also the closer for the D-backs. Now, Sewald was a huge addition for Arizona at the deadline last year. Acquired him in kind of a deal with the Mariners where both teams traded major league pieces and got a little bit better. But Sewald was huge in helping get the Diamondbacks to the World Series last year, was locked down in the 9th inning for Arizona. But he had no oblique injury this year, missed about the first 5 weeks of the season. And even since he came back sometime in May, hasn't really been used a lot by the Diamondbacks. Some of it is because they haven't been very good this year, so there hasn't been as many save situations, but they haven't really used Sewald in situations outside of saves either. He has only pitched in 18 games. He's only thrown 16 2/3 innings for the Diamondbacks this year. Some is from injury, some is just because of low use, but that could be a good thing because his arm is going to be more rested. And remember, it wasn't an arm injury that kept him out. His arm is going to be more rested than basically anybody else in terms of relievers that the Orioles could acquire at the deadline. So for me, that makes him a little more intriguing that, he doesn't have like millions of miles on his arm this year. Now, on the flip side, Sewald has pitched for a little while. He's been in the bigs for a bit, so he's got some innings on that arm. But in those 16 2/3 innings this year, he has been pretty good for Arizona. A .54 ERA. Now, his expected ERA is 2.53. He hasn't been that good. And it's mostly because his strikeout rate is down to 25%, much lower than usual, but only a 5% walk rate. You will certainly take that. Opponents are hitting just .093 against Paul Sewald this year. But I mentioned BABIP, right? Anything under 270, 260, you're probably getting lucky. Opponents have a BABIP against Sewald of 105 this year. He has gotten some extreme luck to get himself to a .54 ERA, but he still has good stuff. It's that fastball that's in the low 90s, and you can't believe it's that good, but it has incredible ride. It almost rises up the zone. He throws it up in the zone, and it becomes impossible to hit, and he pairs it with a pretty good slider as well. Now, who knows if the Diamondbacks will trade him? Again, even though they've been bad, they are right in the thick of the wild card race. They went to the World Series last year. It'd be a tough look for their fans to sell at the deadline a year after they just randomly made it to the World Series. You could easily argue, hey, we're the Diamondbacks. All we got to do is sneak into the wild card at like 83 and 79, and we could go right back to the World Series. So the Diamondbacks seem like a team that may not sell, but if they even decide to maybe sell their rentals, Sewald is another guy who has that 9th inning experience who could really, really help the Orioles at some point this year. Then to number 2 on my list. This is more of a team that may not specifically want to sell to the Orioles, even if they do trade guys away. And that is the Toronto Blue Jays. They have a lot of relievers that have been worse this year than usual, but could be available. But their one guy who has been better than usual this year is the right-hander Yimi Garcia, who is an impending free agent, and we have seen him dominate the Orioles at times this year. Now, Garcia, although he is in the midst of his best season of his major league career, he is also currently on the injured list. He has an elbow injury. It's not requiring Tommy John surgery at this point. The latest report from him earlier this week is that he is throwing from 120 feet. He's trying to make his way back. The weird part about Garcia is he may not even be healthy enough by July 30th that the Orioles would want to trade for him. But if he does return to a big league mound before the deadline and look like the pre-injury version of Garcia, the Orioles should be all over this guy. If A, the Blue Jays decide to sell, they are 8 games out of the wild card right now. I think they should at least sell off their rentals. And B, if they decide they're willing to trade with the Orioles in division, which may not happen. But if they are, give me Yimi Garcia. 28 innings, 5 saves. He's kind of filled in as their number 2 closer this year with a 2.57 ERA, a 2.30 expected ERA, 2.87 FIP. It's been good across the board for Garcia. He's striking out 35% of batters, walking only 6%. Those are elite numbers for Jimmy Garcia. It is a four-seam fastball that is seemingly impossible to hit. 97 miles an hour. Opponents hit just 116 against it. It's got a 36% whiff rate. Throws it up in the zone. Guys just can't track it, can't pick it up. He pairs it with a lot of pitches. Got a curveball, got a sinker, got a sweeper, got a changeup, got a slider. He throws them all, but it's really that four-seamer that is the bread and butter for him. Now, he doesn't get a crazy amount of ground balls. He is more of a fly ball pitcher. It's actually a 24% ground ball rate. That is super, super low. But when your stuff's that good and you're missing enough bats, it's okay to be an extreme fly ball pitcher. Now, the caveat with him here is he's got to be healthy. He might have even been number one on this list if he was healthy right now. You worry about the elbow, don't get me wrong. But if you can prove that he's healthy enough to just get through this season, right? Like he's a rental. You probably wouldn't re-sign him. You just need him healthy enough to pitch through the end of the year. That is a guy who really helps your bullpen. The issue is there's health problems there. Honestly, you could argue you should drop him lower for that, but he's been so good that he only drops from 1 to 2 for me because of potential elbow issues. But speaking of number one on this list, number one is a guy who also may not be traded because his team may not sell. But if the Rangers do decide to sell, again, they are also about 8 games out of the wild card. The Orioles just took 3 of 4 from Texas. They do not look like the team that won the World Series last season. David Robertson is a guy the Orioles should be all over. Yes, he is in his upper 30s. Yes, he was pitching against Nick Markakis back in the day in an Oriole uniform. I think he might have pitched against Miguel Tejada and Melvin Mora in an Oriole uniform. That's how long David Robertson has been in the league when he came up with the Yankees. But he is still really, really good. Now, he does have a mutual option for $7 million for 2025. But mutual options, that's an option where the team and the player have to say yes. They rarely get picked up. So I'm still considering him as a rental free agent, even though there's a possibility of getting him back on fairly cheap for next year. He's making $10 million this year, be pretty cheap. He has his lowest FIP since 2011 with the Yankees, a 2.47 FIP for David Robertson to go along with a 3.34 ERA and 35 innings as kind of the Rangers setup man this year. He's having one of his best seasons in a long, long time. This stuff looks ridiculous. Age hasn't really mattered for David Robertson. He goes up there with that cutter that is still just as good as it was 10 years ago and just strikes out hitter after hitter. A 38% strikeout rate is the highest on this list of relievers that I have for the Orioles. Now, however, the 8% walk rate is not bad. It's just a little higher than some of these guys. But when you're striking out 38% of batters, allowing opponents to hit just 188 against you, I think you can probably live with a few more walks than the rest of these guys. Also, he's got a pretty normal BABIP, so it's not like he's been getting lucky to be this good. He is just missing bats at an elite level with that insane cutter and a couple of more good breaking balls that he throws, which have allowed him to be this good. Now, the funny part about Robertson is he was actually traded at last year's deadline. I think he's having a little bit better season this year, but it was a very similar successful season. He was on the Mets. He was traded to the Marlins last year, and the Mets got 2 kind of up-and-coming teenage prospects. Infielder Marco Vargas, who was a 45-plus future value on Fangraphs, and catcher Ronald Hernandez was a 40 future value. I believe they were like 18 and 19 at the times of the trade. So we even know a price that could be asked for David Robertson. But he would be a guy who would slot in right in the 8th inning before Kimbrel, has closing experience in his career if you needed to, can get righties and lefties out because of that cutter. He is my number one ad. He gets strikeouts. He gets ground balls, which is great. Like, he's not a big fly ball pitcher. In fact, you pull up the ground ball rate for David Robertson, 55%. That's not, Yennier Cano levels, but that's a good ground ball strikeout pitcher, which means he's just not going to give up a lot of runs. And he's a rental, shouldn't be crazy expensive. So you look at what it cost for Robertson last year, and then you think about what is it going to cost overall for the Orioles to get a pitcher like this. Well, if you're looking for the solid non-closer type, a guy having a good year, but certainly isn't a 9th inning guy, maybe like the Adam Ottavinos or the John Brebbias who were at the bottom of my list. You look back to trades last year. How about Keenan Middleton? Was having a solid season, was a rental middle reliever, got traded. They got back 135 future value pitching prospect. Think of a 22-year-old right-hander, Juan De Los Santos, who's a pitching prospect in low A, who's got a really good fastball, but he kind of doesn't know where it's going at this point and is very far away from the big leagues. That's basically what it would take to get like a Brebbia or an Ottavino. That is a no-brainer trade. Now, if you're looking for more of that good late inning guy, a David Robertson, a Jimmy Garcia, a Carlos Estevez type, you're going to give up a little more. I mentioned the two teenagers that the Mets had, or the Marlins had to give up to the Mets last year. Let's look at the Jordan Hicks trade last year. He was a really good eighth inning guy for the Cardinals last season. Had a little bit of struggles, but was pulling it back together. He was traded from St. Louis to Toronto. The Blue Jays gave up two starting pitching prospects, one in Adam Kloffenstein, kind of a 40 future value guy, and one in Sem Reverse, who was a 45 future value guy. To me, that's something like the Orioles giving up maybe Brandon Young and Juan Nunez in a trade to get a guy like David Robertson. If that is the cost to me, I'm doing it. I know that some people think Nunez and Young could both be like good pitchers for the Orioles at the major league level over the next couple of years, but I don't think either of those guys are helping the Orioles in 2024. And I don't think either of those guys are any kind of elite pitching prospects. If you can get a guy like Robertson to help your bullpen, I am making a deal like that. But that is my wish list of rental relievers. Let me know in the comments here. Like, comment, and subscribe to the Locked On Orioles YouTube channel. And let me know, hey, where's your wish list of rental relievers? What did I get right? What did I get wrong on this list as we kind of preview the trade deadline here? But one more quick segment to get to before we finish up. The Orioles did make two minor league signings last week. One is kind of a nothing signing. The other one is a little bit intriguing, though. We'll get to both of them to finish off the pod coming up next. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is also brought to you by Prize Picks, which is for me the most fun and exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Prize Picks, it's really the #1 daily fantasy sports app. It's got over 5 million active users in the US. So you ask, how do you play? Well, Prize Picks provides you with numbers, and all you do is pick more or less on anywhere from 2 to 6 player stat projections. You just watch the winnings roll in. You can now win up to 100 times your money on Prize Picks with as little as 4 correct picks. Turn $10 into $1,000 with the WNBA. Caitlin Clark, more or less this amount of points. Angel Reese, more or less than this amount of rebounds. You pick it right, you get the money. And of course, there are Major League Baseball numbers every single night. Maybe you're looking at Corbin Burns in the return. He is a new dad. Does he get more or less than 6.5 strikeouts? I'd say more. You go for it. So download the Prize Picks app today and use code LOCKEDONMLB for a first deposit match up to $100. That's code LOCKEDONMLB on Prize Picks for a deposit match up to $100. At Prize Picks, pick more, pick less. It's that easy. So to finish off the episode today, just did want to update you on two guys the Orioles brought in on minor league deals last week to add some depth. We'll start with Niko Goodrum, 32-year-old switch-hitting utility man who the Orioles brought in. He was briefly in the big leagues with both the Angels and the Rays this year, 13 games. He went 3 for 29 at the plate with 3 singles, 10 strikeouts, and 3 walks. Wasn't very good, but he's been in the big league since 2017. He's played for the Twins, the Tigers, the Astros, the Rays, the Angels. Really had one solid offensive season. That was all the way back in 2018 with the Tigers. Went to the KBO last year and was pretty good before coming back to the States. Really why you bring in Niko Goodrum is A, the Orioles are dealing with some injuries in the upper minor leagues, and they're having to call up a lot of guys that really don't need to be called up yet. So they're bringing in, remember they brought in Garrett Cooper last week just to have some bodies with big league experience in AAA to help pass through these injuries. Like Jackson Holliday is playing, but he's still not playing the field, still DHing since coming back from the elbow inflammation. So because of that, Goodrum has literally played every position but catcher at the major league level. And in just 13 games in the big leagues this year, he's already spent time at first base, second base, shortstop, third base, and left field. So he is super versatile. He's going to be the perfect guy to send to AAA Norfolk. He's not going to start a lot, but he's just going to be there to fill in for anybody at any position at any time, start once or twice a week when you need him, bring him off the bench. I see very little to no chance he plays for the Orioles at any point this year, but it'll be nice depth to have. He's not going to steal anyone's at-bats, just going to be there to kind of cover up these injuries for a little bit. Now, the more interesting one is Burch Smith, 34-year-old right-handed reliever who the Orioles also brought in on a minor league deal and sent to AAA Norfolk. Now, Burch Smith actually debuted in Major League Baseball way back in 2013 with the Padres, but then struggled, had Tommy John that took him out for 2 years, and did not return to Major League Baseball until 2018. Pitched for the Royals, the Brewers, the Giants, and Oakland from 2018 to 2021. Wasn't very good. Went to Japan in 22, went to the KBO in Korea in 23, then had a shoulder injury and kept him out for the rest of last season. came back to the States this year, signed a deal with the Rays, traded to the Marlins before opening day. And with the Marlins this year, out of the big league bullpen, Smith was 29 and 2/3 innings, 4.25 ERA, 17% strikeout rate, not very good, 7% walk rate, pretty good, and a 47% ground ball rate. He kept the ball on the ground, but his stuff is good, has a 102 stuff plus, whereas somewhere in the mid-90s is generally league average. And it's a really good changeup that he was known for as a pitching prospect that he hasn't really thrown as much lately. He was DFA'd by the Marlins a couple of weeks ago and then released. The Orioles picked him up. It's a four-seam fastball that sits around 94. It's got some okay swing and miss, got some okay data on it. Then he throws a slower curveball that, at times can really turn into his, just get me over, get me a called strike kind of pitch for Burch Smith. Then you kind of go down the list a little bit. He's got this cutter that he throws that he looks for some swing and miss at times, but he's mostly trying to jam left-handers with that pitch. Then he'll throw a sweeper, and then it's his changeup. His changeup, he only threw 7 times at the big league level this year with the Marlins, but that is the pitch that the data loved when he was a prospect. That is the pitch that I think the Orioles are going to love, and I think they're going to have him keep the four-seamer, keep the changeup, and then go with one other breaking ball and try and remake him into a big league reliever. Because again, although he was on a terrible team, he did throw 30 big league innings this year. So if I had to guess, I think Burch Smith will pitch for the Orioles at some point this year. Now, who knows if it'll be a legitimate role or just filling in for a couple of games, but it's a nice depth guy to bring in that could help this bullpen. And I mentioned all those rental relievers. There's still guys on signings and on waivers that you could bring in and add. Maybe Burch Smith is one of those guys with some underlying stuff that the Orioles could work with to turn him into, at the very least, maybe he's, this year's Jacob Webb. Maybe he's a solid middle reliever that comes out of nowhere for you late in the season. But that'll do it for today's episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. Again, we'll be back tomorrow to recap games 1 and 2 between the Orioles and the Mariners. Until then, I'm Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.